Welcome to Hungarian Insights, your go-to channel for exploring Hungary's rich history, vibrant culture, and language learning resources. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most transformative periods in Hungarian history, from the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 to the aftermath of World War I. What led to the empire's rise and fall? And how did it shape Hungary's destiny? Let's find out.
Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at a really pivotal period in Hungarian history, the era from the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, leading into the tumultuous years of World War I.
Oh, definitely a fascinating period.
Yeah, it's interesting how this period, often seen as a golden age, also kind of contained the seeds of future conflicts.
That's a great point. It's striking how the compromise itself, meant to solidify the empire, inadvertently set the stage for its eventual downfall. It's a classic example of how even well-intentioned political solutions can have really unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 basically created this dual monarchy, right? Austria and Hungary as equals within one state.
Exactly. It was a response to the failed Hungarian Revolution of 1848, a way to kind of appease Hungarian demands for greater autonomy. And it did lead to a period of significant economic growth and modernization, particularly in Budapest. You could almost feel the energy of progress radiating from the city as it transformed itself.
I see. So like they were trying to build a modern nation, like within the framework of this centuries-old empire.
Yeah,
Did that create any friction?
absolutely. While the compromise brought prosperity to certain segments of Hungarian society, it didn't really address the underlying tensions within the empire. Other nationalities, feeling marginalized, saw this as Hungarian dominance, not equality.
Oh, so beneath the surface of this so-called golden age, you have these simmering resentments
Exactly.
just waiting for a spark to ignite them.
Precisely. And that spark came in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, alongside Germany, found itself on one side of this global conflict, facing off against the Allied powers.
Gotcha. So you got to imagine the impact this had on a society that had, enjoyed this period of relative peace and prosperity.
Yeah. The war was devastating for the empire. Heavy losses on the battlefield, economic turmoil, and a growing sense of national trauma. It all contributed to the eventual collapse of this once mighty power.
Yeah, for sure. And for Hungary, it was the Treaty of Trianon in 1920 that dealt the final blow, right? I was reading about the redrawing of borders, and wow, did everyday Hungarians realize just how much their world was about to change.
It was a profound shock. Imagine losing over 70% of your territory and two-thirds of your population. It's a national trauma that continues to shape Hungarian identity to this day.
Wow, yeah, so you have this period leading up to World War I, where Hungary is experiencing this, economic boom, but it's also entangled in this complex multi-ethnic empire with all these unresolved tensions. And then the war comes and just shatters everything. And then to top it off, the Treaty of Trianon reshapes their world in a way that's, almost impossible to fathom.
The period from the compromise to the end of World War I is a stark illustration of how quickly fortunes can shift, how internal and external pressures can converge to reshape a nation's destiny. It raises crucial questions about the sustainability of empires, the complexities of national identity, and the enduring consequences of war and treaties.
Yeah, it makes you think, right? We often talk about the lessons of history, and this era seems packed with them. What stands out to you as a particularly important takeaway for this period?
I think the key takeaway is that progress and prosperity don't necessarily guarantee stability. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise, while bringing economic benefits, failed to address the fundamental issue of inequality within the empire, and this unresolved tension, when coupled with the pressures of a global war, ultimately led to its disintegration.
So even in times of apparent success, it's crucial to pay attention to those underlying fissures, those voices that are being marginalized.
Yeah.
Because history shows us that if those issues aren't addressed, they can come back to haunt you in, dramatic and unexpected ways.
Absolutely. And I think that's a valuable lesson for us to remember, not just when studying history, but also when considering the challenges we face in our own time.
Absolutely. Now, I know we have a lot more ground to cover, but before we move on to the next chapter in Hungarian history, is there anything else that really struck you about this particular period? Anything you think our listeners should keep in mind as we delve further into this fascinating story?
One thing that's particularly fascinating is how the experience of this era, the compromise, the rise of nationalism, the devastation of war, and the Treaty of Trianon laid the groundwork for the political and social dynamics that would shape Hungary in the decades to come. It's almost like we're seeing the seeds of future events being planted right here.
Okay, so it sounds like we're dealing with a bit of a historical chain reaction here. The events of this era had a ripple effect, influencing everything that came after. And that sets the stage perfectly for us to dive into the next chapter, which, well, let's just say things are about to get even more complex.
Yeah, it's almost like the ground was still trembling from that First World War earthquake, and Hungary was trying to find its footing amidst the aftershocks.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And as we move into the period immediately following the World War I, it seems like Hungary went through this, incredibly turbulent phase, almost like a political pendulum swinging wildly back and forth.
You're absolutely right. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire left this void, a power vacuum that different factions were eager to fill. Each one had like a drastically different vision for what Hungary should become.
Right, so it was a period of revolutions and counter-revolutions, right? With figures like Mihaly Karolyi and Béla Kun vying for control.
Yeah, Karolyi, a liberal aristocrat, led the first government after Hungary declared independence in 1918. He tried to implement democratic reforms, but was facing incredible challenges. The economy was in shambles, and there were pressures both internally and from the victorious powers who were, redrawing the map of Europe.
So it was this, fragile democracy almost doomed from the start.
It was certainly a difficult time to try and establish a new political order. And then in 1919, Béla Kun, a communist revolutionary, seized power and established the Hungarian Soviet Republic. It was a short-lived but intense period marked by radical social and economic changes. You see nationalization of industry, land redistribution. It was a complete upheaval of the old order.
Wow, so from a struggling democracy to a communist state, it sounds like Hungary was caught in this whirlwind of ideologies in those years, immediately following the war.
Yeah, and all this while still dealing with the territorial losses from the Treaty of Trianon, which created tensions with neighboring countries. It was a recipe for instability and fear.
So what happened to Kun's Soviet Republic? It didn't last very long, did it?
No, it didn't. Kun's regime faced strong opposition from both within Hungary and from neighboring countries who were deeply concerned about the spread of communism. By August of 1919, it had collapsed, and Kun fled into exile.
Okay, and that's when Miklos Horthy enters the scene.
Yes, Horthy, a former admiral in the Austro-Hungarian Navy, entered Budapest with his national army and quickly established himself as the regent of Hungary. This marks the beginning of what's known as the Horthy era, a period that would last for several decades.
Okay, this is quite a shift. From a brief experiment with communism to a regime led by a military figure.
Horthy's rule was authoritarian in nature, a stark contrast to the democratic aspirations that had fueled the earlier revolution. He believed in a strong central government, suppressed political opposition, and perhaps most significantly, held a deep resentment for the Treaty of Trianon.
Right, so Horthy comes to power in this Hungary that's been, deeply wounded both physically and psychologically by the war and the loss of territory.
Exactly, and that sense of national loss, that desire to revise the Treaty of Trianon, became a defining feature of the Horthy era. It influenced domestic politics and also shaped Hungary's foreign policy, leading them to seek alliances with other revisionist powers like Mussolini's Italy and later Hitler's Germany.
And we know where those alliances ultimately lead down a very dangerous path during World War II. But before we get there, I'm curious about the impact of this interwar period on the everyday lives of Hungarians. What was it like to live in Hungary under Horthy's rule?
Well, it was a complex time. On the one hand, there was a degree of stability and economic recovery after the chaos of those early post-war years. But, on the other hand, there was this growing shadow of authoritarianism with limitations on political freedoms and a simmering resentment over the Treaty of Trianon that kind of permeated society.
So it was like this balancing act between trying to rebuild and being consumed by this sense of loss and injustice. Did that create a climate of fear? Or were there pockets of resistance to Horthy's rule?
Oh, there were definitely pockets of resistance, especially among intellectuals and those who, longed for a more democratic system. But Horthy's regime was quite effective at suppressing dissent. And the allure of regaining lost territory, which he promised to pursue, was a powerful force that resonated with many Hungarians.
So almost like the pain of Trianon became this open wound that Horthy was able to exploit to maintain his grip on power.
Yeah, that's a very apt analogy. And as the 1930s progressed and Europe marched towards another war, Hungary found itself increasingly drawn into the orbit of Nazi Germany.
Which, as we know, led to their participation in World War II on the side of the Axis powers.
Exactly. And this decision had profound consequences, not just for Hungary's territorial integrity, but also for its moral standing. The alliance with Nazi Germany meant complicity in the horrors of the Holocaust, a dark chapter that continues to haunt the nation's conscience.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile this period with the image of Hungary as this, nation that had experienced such cultural and economic flourishing just a few decades earlier.
Right. It's a stark reminder that even societies with rich histories and achievements can be seduced by extremist ideologies, especially in times of national trauma and perceived victimhood.
Yeah. So what happened to Hungary during the war? How did their alliance with Germany play out?
Well, initially, Hungary benefited territorially. They regained some of the lands lost in Trianon, which fueled a sense of vindication among many. However, as the tide of war turned against Germany, Hungary found itself occupied by Nazi forces and facing devastating consequences.
It's a tragic turn of events. It seems like in their pursuit of reversing the losses of Trianon, they ended up suffering even greater losses.
Yeah, and not just territorial losses, the human cost was immense, particularly for the Jewish community who faced persecution and deportation under the Nazi occupation. It's a period of immense suffering that continues to cast a long shadow over Hungarian history.
For sure. So at the end of the war, Hungary was in ruins, defeated, occupied, and facing a very uncertain future.
That's right, and as the Soviet Red Army pushed westward, Hungary found itself falling under the influence of another powerful force, ushering in a new era of communist rule.
Wow, from one empire to another. It seems like Hungary spent much of the 20th century struggling to assert its own identity and independence. But as we've seen throughout our deep dive, the Hungarian people have this, remarkable resilience. They've faced incredible hardships and setbacks, yet they always seem to find a way to rebuild and move forward.
It's truly a testament to their strength and spirit. And while this deep dive has explored a tumultuous and often tragic period in Hungarian history, it also offers a glimpse into the indomitable spirit of a nation determined to forge its own path. From the ashes of empires and the devastation of war, they've emerged with a renewed sense of identity and a commitment to democracy and freedom.
For sure. It's been a fascinating journey, though certainly not without its dark moments. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is how crucial it is to understand the complexities of history. How seemingly unconnected events like the Austro-Hungarian Compromise can ripple outward, influencing decisions and shaping destinies for generations to come.
And how those ripples can carry both progress and destruction, prosperity and suffering. History is never just a simple story, and that's what makes it so compelling and so essential to study.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for guiding us through this deep dive, and thank you, dear listener, for joining us. We hope this has sparked your curiosity about this pivotal period in Hungarian history and inspired you to continue exploring its depths. Until next time, keep diving.
Our podcast discussions are based on our ebook, Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. History, literature, art, music, science, sport. Scan the QR code or check the link in the description to download your copy of Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. As a special bonus, you'll also receive the Illustrated Companion, featuring over 100 detailed illustrations to visually enrich your understanding of the book's content. Thank you for watching.